It was a cold, moonless night when the figure of an unknown man appeared in the graveyard, moving cautiously between the rows of weathered headstones. The wind whispered through the trees, their branches creaking under the weight of years. The man's footsteps were muffled on the damp earth, yet his presence seemed to disrupt the silence that had long embraced the cemetery. His hands were firm and steady, though his eyes betrayed a certain heaviness, a burden that had weighed him down for far too long. He was digging carefully, almost as if he had done this before. The shovel cut through the soil with a rhythm that echoed the beats of a heavy heart. Every movement seemed purposeful, deliberate, though no one was around to witness it. The graveyard was deserted save for the ghosts of the past and the sounds of the man's solitary labor. Yet, even in this loneliness, something about his presence felt both urgent and deeply emotional. At a distance, hidden in the shadows of a tall, crooked tombstone, a servant watched him. The man had been working at the graveyard for years, though he had never seen anyone like this before. There was something unsettling about the unknown man, his movements, the way he avoided the light, and the strange sense of sadness that clung to him. The servant had learned to be observant over the years. He had witnessed many strange events in the graveyard, but this one felt different. His curiosity grew as he watched the man dig with such intent. What was he looking for? Why was he here, in the dead of night? The servant's heart raced. He wasn't sure whether to approach the man or wait for him to leave, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something needed to be done. There was an unspoken rule in the graveyard: respect for the dead and the living. And this man, whoever he was breaking that rule by digging on hallowed ground without explanation. After a moment of hesitation, the servant decided to confront him. He stepped out from behind the tombstone, his shoes crunching lightly on the gravel. The sound was enough to make the man pause, shovel in midair. He turned slowly, and for a moment their eyes met. The man's gaze was sharp, wary, as if he had been expecting this confrontation. He stood up straight, wiping his hands on his worn trousers before speaking in a low, almost apologetic voice. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice carrying the weight of years of regret. The servant stood still for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "What are you doing here?" he finally asked, his voice steady, though there was an edge of curiosity in it. "This is sacred ground." The man looked at him, a sigh escaping his lips as he slowly put down the shovel. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not here to cause harm. I'm here to bury something I've carried with me for far too long." The servant frowned, puzzled. "Bury something?" he repeated, his gaze shifting between the man and the grave he had been digging. "What is it that you need to bury?" The man paused, as if weighing the servant's question carefully. For a long moment the two stood in silence, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. Then the man spoke again, his voice soft but filled with an intensity that made the servant lean in closer. "It's not just a grave I'm digging," the man said. "It's a grave for the past, for the mistakes I made. A grave for someone I loved deeply but failed to protect." His eyes flickered with a mixture of pain and regret, the weight of his words heavy in the air. The servant could feel the tension growing between them, his curiosity intensifying. Who are you burying?" the servant asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if lost in the memories of long ago. Finally, the man spoke again, his words carrying a sorrowful truth that would change everything. "I'm burying my sister," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "The woman you see here, in this graveyard. She was wronged by our family, and I couldn't protect her when she needed me the most." The servant's eyes widened in shock. "Your sister?" he repeated, unable to hide his surprise. He had heard stories about the family that once lived nearby, but nothing like this. There was a mystery here, something far deeper than he could have ever imagined. The man nodded, his face etched with the pain of the past. "Yes, my sister," he said softly. "She was accused of something she didn't do. She was abandoned by everyone, even me. And now, I've come to make things right." As the man's words sank in, The servant felt a strange sense of empathy for him. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about this man's sorrow that resonated deeply within him. Something told him that this was not just about a grave or an old family secret. It was something more. Something that was about to change everything. The servant stood silently for a moment, processing the man's words. His mind raced, trying to understand the gravity of what he had just heard. A family betrayal, a woman wronged. This was no ordinary story. The grave before him had a story that reached far deeper than the soil he had been digging. The mystery that surrounded the man was growing by the second, and the servant couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something far more complex than a simple burial. He took a step closer to the man, his curiosity burning brighter than his hesitation. "But why now?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Why come back after all these years? What makes you think you can make it right?" The man's face twisted in pain, as if the question itself had dug into old wounds. "Because," he began slowly, "I've spent my life trying to forget, trying to outrun the guilt, but I can't. Not anymore. I owe her an explanation. I owe her the truth." There was a long pause as the man's gaze drifted towards the grave that lay before them. The servant watched him closely, sensing that this was a moment of deep reflection, a moment where the man was confronting the mistakes of his past. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees, as if the graveyard itself was holding its breath. The man looked back at the servant, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and desperation. "She was my sister," he repeated softly. "Her name was Sarah. We were close once when we were children, but everything changed. We were torn apart by lies, by a terrible misunderstanding, and I let her down." The servant's heart softened. He had heard whispers about Sarah, a woman who had once been a part of the prominent family that owned the graveyard. The stories spoke of her fall from grace, how she had been shunned by her own family after a scandal had ripped through their lives. But there were no details, just rumors, whispers in the dark. Nobody ever spoke of the truth. "What happened to her?" the servant asked, unable to hold back his curiosity. "Why was she shunned? Why are you digging here in this graveyard to bury her memory?" The man's face darkened as he glanced around the graveyard. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, as if the words were hard to form, but the need to speak them had become overwhelming. "She was accused of something she didn't do," he said, his voice low but steady. "A crime she didn't commit. And I, her own brother, stood by and did nothing." The servant's eyes widened. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. "What crime?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the ground beneath them might collapse under the weight of the answer. The man exhaled slowly, a deep breath that seemed to carry years of sorrow. He looked at the servant, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and sorrow. "She was accused of stealing from the family, the most valuable heirloom we had, the family's ring. It was priceless, passed down through generations. But she didn't take it. It was someone else, someone close to the family." The servant's brow furrowed. "But if she didn't take it, why did they accuse her?" The man's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he spoke. "Because they wanted her out of the picture. My uncle, he was the one who set her up. He was greedy, and he wanted to get rid of her. He knew the ring would be the perfect way to ruin her reputation, to make sure she was never a threat to his power. And I—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "I believed the lies. I didn't fight for her. I turned my back on her." The servant felt his chest tighten as he listened to the man's confession. He could hear the pain in his voice, the regret that seemed to seep from every word. It was clear that the man had lived a life of torment, carrying the weight of this mistake for years. "So what happened to her?" the servant asked, his voice barely audible now. The man's face softened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of tenderness in his eyes. "She was driven out of the family. She left, disappeared into the world. We never saw her again, and when she died," and his voice faltered, "no one knew. No one cared. Not even me." The servant swallowed hard, feeling a deep sense of empathy for the man standing before him. The grief, the guilt, it was all so raw, so real. And yet the man had come here, to this graveyard, to make things right, to bury the past that had haunted him for so long. I've been searching for her for years, the man continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been trying to find the truth, to clear her name, and now I finally know what I need to do. I have to honor her memory. I have to reveal the truth, who really took the ring, and why. The servant felt a lump form in his throat as the man spoke, his words stirring something deep within him. He could see the man's resolve, the need to make things right, to unearth the truth no matter how painful it might be. The grave, once a symbol of death, was now a symbol of redemption. I'm not just burying her, the man said, his eyes now fixed on the grave. I'm burying my shame, my guilt, and I'm finally ready to tell her the truth. The servant nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the man's story. He had never expected this, never imagined that a simple grave digging in the middle of the night would lead to such an emotional revelation. But now, standing in the moonlight, with the graveyard stretched out before him, he knew one thing for sure. This story was far from over. As the man stood there, silently reflecting, the servant couldn't help but feel that he was part of something much larger than himself, something that had been buried for too long but was now coming to light. The wind had started to pick up again, rustling the leaves above and creating an eerie whisper in the graveyard. The servant stood quietly, his mind racing with the gravity of what he had just heard. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah. Her name, so simple, yet so filled with the weight of a painful history. She had been accused of a crime she didn't commit, abandoned by her family, and left to die alone. It was a story he had only heard in hushed tones, but now, standing before this stranger who was clearly a man broken by his past, the truth seemed to come alive with each word spoken. The man stood motionless, staring at the grave he had been digging, his hand clenched around the shovel. The servant could see the tremble in his hands, the raw emotion in his eyes as he stood there, caught between the past and the present. The guilt, the grief. It was all there, woven into the very fabric of the night. And yet, despite all that had happened, the man was determined to make things right. The question was, could he truly undo the damage done so many years ago? Breaking the silence, the servant finally spoke. So, you're going to confront your uncle? The one who framed your sister? His voice was cautious, but there was a deep curiosity in his tone. He had to know more. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still so much left unanswered. The man looked up slowly, his gaze meeting the servant's. Yes, he said softly, his voice filled with determination. I've come here for a reason, and it's not just to bury my sister's memory. It's to find justice for her. I've spent years running from the truth, but now it's time to face it. I'm going to confront my uncle no matter the cost. The servant felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea what this confrontation would look like, but something told him it would be far more dangerous than just words. The man's resolve was strong, but the weight of the past seemed to drag him down, as if every step toward the truth was a step toward opening an old wound that might never heal. Do you know where he is? The servant asked, a sense of urgency creeping into his voice. He had been in this graveyard long enough to know that things weren't always as they seemed. People came and went, but some things, some truths, stayed buried, hidden from the world for a reason. The man nodded slowly. I've tracked him down. He's living in a small house on the edge of town. He's old now, but he's still dangerous. He's the one who made sure Sarah was never able to clear her name, and he's the one who made sure the truth stayed buried. The servant felt his heart beat faster. The air seemed to thicken around them, the graveyard now feeling more like a battlefield than a place of rest. What kind of man could do such a thing? To accuse an innocent woman, to destroy her life, and to bury the truth so deep that even family couldn't find their way back. It was an injustice beyond comprehension. And yet, here they were, about to dig into the very heart of it. The man continued, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking to himself. I've thought about this moment for years. I've dreamed of it, of confronting him, of making him pay for what he did to her. But I know it won't be easy. He has power, and he has the family's support. If I go after him now, it could destroy what little is left of me. The servant stood still, his mind whirling with the weight of the man's words. The idea of confronting someone so powerful, someone with the ability to destroy lives without hesitation, was terrifying. But there was a strange sense of justice in the man's voice, a sense of finality that seemed to push him forward no matter the cost. "I can help you," the servant said suddenly, surprising even himself with the offer. He hadn't planned on getting involved, but something about the man's quest for redemption, the way he was so determined to make things right, struck a chord deep inside him. It was as if the man's burden had become his own. The man turned to him, his eyes searching. "Help me?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "How?" "I don't know what you need to do to confront him," the servant replied, his voice steady now. "But I can help you with whatever comes next. I know this graveyard. I know the people. I can help you gather what you need to expose the truth." The man stood in silence for a moment, his eyes locked with the servant's, then slowly he nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't do this alone. And you seem to understand the weight of what I'm carrying. I appreciate it." There was a brief, almost imperceptible smile on the man's face, but it was filled with sorrow rather than relief. The servant wasn't sure if the smile was for him, or if it was a fleeting moment of understanding between two men who had both lived in the shadows of regret for too long. "We need to go tomorrow," the man said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We can't waste any more time. I've waited too long. It's time for the truth to come out." The servant nodded. "I'll be ready," he said, his voice firm. He could feel the tension in the air, as if the very ground beneath their feet was preparing for the storm that was about to come. As the two men stood in the graveyard, the moonlight now casting long shadows across the graves, the servant couldn't help but wonder what the confrontation would bring. The man's journey to right the wrongs of the past had only just begun, but already it felt like the beginning of something that would change everything. The grave that lay before them was no longer just a place of burial. It was a symbol of the past that refused to stay silent, a past that was determined to be heard once more. And as they prepared to face the truth, the servant knew one thing for certain: the graveyard had never held such a heavy secret. The next day arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The graveyard, bathed in the soft light of morning, felt different now. What had once been a place of peace and quiet was now the backdrop for something far more profound. The servant could feel the tension in his bones, a sense of urgency that pushed him forward, despite the fear and uncertainty that lingered at the edge of his mind. The man had left early, determined to confront his uncle. The servant had agreed to meet him at the edge of town, where the man had located his uncle's small, isolated house. As the servant walked through the cemetery to prepare for the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything they were about to face would be far more complicated and dangerous than they could have anticipated. The day was calm, but the servant knew better than to take comfort in the stillness. He had spent enough time in the graveyard to understand that the past was never as simple as it appeared. And today, the past was about to come rushing forward with all the force of a storm. When the servant reached the edge of town, he spotted the man waiting by the side of the road. He looked different now. His face, though still heavy with the weight of years, seemed more determined, more resolute than before. The grief that had once consumed him had been replaced by something sharper, something that made his presence more intimidating than it had been the night before. The servant approached him slowly. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice filled with caution. He had seen how deep the man's pain ran, and he knew that confronting his uncle would open old wounds. It wouldn't just be a matter of speaking the truth. It would be a battle for justice, one that could change everything for both of them. The man nodded firmly. "I've waited too long for this. It's time to confront the person who ruined my sister's life. It's time for him to pay for what he did." The servant hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "I understand," he said quietly, "but be careful. You don't know what he's capable of. This could turn ugly." The man's gaze hardened, his jaw clenched. "I don't care. He's the reason my sister is gone. He's the reason I've been running from the truth all these years. It ends today." Together they made their way to the house, a small, weathered building at the edge of town. The shutters were drawn tight, and the garden had long since fallen into disrepair. It looked like a place that had been forgotten by time, just like the man's uncle who had remained hidden away from the world for so long. As they approached the house, the servant could sense the tension building between them. The man walked ahead, his steps purposeful, while the servant followed just a step behind. The house seemed to loom over them, a silent reminder of all the years of betrayal, deceit, and sorrow that had been buried here. When they reached the door, the man didn't hesitate. He knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the quiet air. The servant watched closely as the man's hand tightened around the doorframe. His face was hard, his eyes sharp, as if he were ready to face whatever awaited them on the other side. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with sharp eyes and a weathered face. He stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the two men before him, as if trying to place them. Then a cold smile spread across his lips. "Well, well," the uncle said, his voice gravelly but still carrying an air of authority. "It's been a long time, hasn't it? What brings you here after all these years?" The man stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here for the truth," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I'm here to make you pay for what you did to Sarah." The uncle's smile faltered slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Sarah?" he repeated, his voice thick with feigned confusion. "What are you talking about? You've been gone for so long, the past is dead. Let it stay that way." But the man wasn't fooled. "You can't bury the truth forever," he said, his voice rising with each word. "You framed her. You ruined her life. You made sure she died alone without anyone to clear her name. And now it's time for you to face what you did." The uncle's expression shifted. For a moment, the servant thought he saw a flash of fear in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by a sneer. "You're wasting your time," he spat. "It's over. Your sister was weak. She couldn't even save herself. She deserved what she got." The words hit the man like a physical blow. The servant could see the rage building in his eyes, the pain of the years crashing down upon him all at once. But there was something more now, a burning resolve that seemed to set his every movement alight with purpose. "You will not get away with it," the man said, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling within him. "You will not get away with it," the man said, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling within him. "You'll pay for what you did, I swear it." The uncle laughed bitterly, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was the laugh of someone who had buried their secret so deeply that they thought they could never be uncovered. "You think you can expose me now?" he sneered. "You don't know the half of it. You never did." The servant felt a chill run down his spine as the uncle's words echoed in the air. He could sense that the man's uncle was hiding something far darker than even the man had anticipated. This wasn't just about a stolen ring or a family betrayal. There was more to this story, something the uncle was desperate to keep hidden. And as the man prepared to speak again, the servant couldn't help but wonder. What was the truth that had been buried for so long, and what would it cost them both to finally uncover it? The silence that followed the uncle's bitter laugh hung in the air, thick with tension. The servant could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of what was happening pressing down on him like a heavy fog. The man beside him was trembling with rage, yet there was something else in his eyes, something deeper than anger. It was the unmistakable spark of determination. He had come too far to turn back now. The uncle stood in the doorway, his expression hardening as he watched the two men waiting for the next move. The air between them was charged as if something monumental was about to be revealed, something that could change everything. "You don't know everything, do you?" The uncle's voice was cold now, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "You think you can come here and make me pay for what I did to Sarah? You think the past can be undone?" The man's fists clenched at his sides, but his voice remained calm, measured. "I don't need to know everything. I know enough. You framed her. You ruined her life. You made sure she was never given a chance to defend herself. That's all that matters." The uncle's face twisted into a sneer, his eyes flashing with malice. "You're so naive," he spat. "Sarah was weak. She couldn't handle the truth, and neither could you." The man took a step forward, his resolve hardening. "You're the one who couldn't handle the truth. You manipulated everyone, including me. You destroyed our family." At this, the uncle's smirk faltered. For a moment, there was a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a look of pure defiance. "You don't know the full story," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. "You don't know what Sarah really did." The man's eyes widened. "What are you talking about? What did she do?" The uncle's lips twisted into a grim smile. "Sarah wasn't as innocent as you think. She wasn't the sweet, wronged angel you've built her up to be. She had secrets. Dark ones. And those secrets are the reason she ended up where she did." The servant felt a shiver run down his spine, the weight of the uncle's words settling heavily in the air. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Was it possible that there was more to the story? Was Sarah truly as innocent as the man believed, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? The man seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. He turned to the servant, his eyes filled with desperation. "What is he talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling with the fear of an uncertain truth. "What secrets? She wasn't perfect, but she didn't deserve what happened to her." The uncle took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "Oh, she didn't deserve it. You're right about that. No one deserves to die the way she did. But she was part of something much bigger than you could ever understand." The servant felt his breath catch in his throat. The uncle's words were like a puzzle piece falling into place, shifting the entire narrative, creating more questions than answers. The man's face twisted in confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice rising. "What are you talking about?" The uncle chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills through the servant. "She was involved in a scheme, a conspiracy, really. And I wasn't the only one who knew about it. But I was the only one who was willing to make sure she never spoke a word of it. She was going to expose everything. That's why I had to act." The man's breath caught in his throat, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. "No," he whispered, almost to himself. "She wasn't part of any scheme. She would never have done that. She—" "Don't be so sure," the uncle interrupted, his voice growing darker. "She was being blackmailed. She had no choice. She did things, terrible things. But she was trying to make it right. She was going to tell you everything, but she never got the chance. And that, my dear nephew, is why she ended up in that grave, alone, with no one to remember her." The servant felt his legs grow weak, the air in the room suffocating him. He could see the man's face now, betrayal, confusion, and horror, all mixed together in one tortured expression. The man had come here seeking answers, but now he was faced with a truth he wasn't prepared to hear. "Sarah?" the man whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, she couldn't have." But the uncle's smile only deepened. "She wasn't the innocent soul you thought she was. She made choices just like everyone else, and those choices led to her downfall." The man's knees buckled slightly, and he stepped back, his mind reeling from the impact of his uncle's words. The servant could see the struggle within him. This wasn't the answer he had been hoping for. It was a revelation that shattered everything he thought he knew about his sister. How could he reconcile the image of the woman he had loved and defended with the person his uncle was describing? For a long moment there was nothing but silence. The uncle watched them both with a cold, calculating gaze, his victory clear in his eyes. But the servant, despite the confusion and the weight of what had been said, knew that this wasn't over. The truth was still out there. And something inside him told him that the uncle was not telling the whole story. "Enough," the servant said, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "You've said enough. We came here for the truth, and we'll get it, whether you like it or not." The uncle scoffed, turning away. "You think you can change anything now?" he said bitterly. "You've already lost." The servant stepped forward, placing himself between the man and the uncle. "We haven't lost anything yet." And with that, the search for the real truth began to take an unexpected turn. The lies had been exposed, but the deeper mystery, the one that had been buried beneath layers of secrets, was still waiting to be uncovered. The uncle's mocking tone seemed to hang in the air, echoing with the finality of someone who thought they had won. But the servant, despite the whirlwind of confusion and fear that had overtaken him, could feel something else stirring within him, a sense of resolve that was slowly taking shape. He could sense that the man beside him was on the brink of breaking, yet he knew that they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The servant stood still for a moment, gathering his thoughts, his mind racing through the tangled web of lies that had been spun. The uncle had said enough to leave them both shaken, but there were still gaps, pieces of the story that didn't quite fit. The man was devastated, his face pale, his body trembling with the force of the revelation. But he was not broken. Not yet. There was still too much to uncover. "You've been lying," the servant said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "There's something you're not telling us, something you're still hiding." The uncle turned slowly, his eyes narrowing with cold fury. "I've told you everything you need to know," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think I'm afraid of you? You think you can change what's already been done? You've lost, all of you." But the servant wasn't so sure. There was something in the uncle's eyes, a flicker of fear perhaps, or a hint of guilt, that suggested there was more to the story. He had been watching him closely, and he knew that the uncle wasn't as confident as he appeared. Something wasn't adding up. The man, still reeling from the shock, finally spoke. "You're lying," he said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You're hiding something. I can feel it. I know you didn't do this alone." The uncle's expression darkened, and for a brief moment, the servant saw a flash of something deeper, a flicker of fear, like a man who had been cornered. It was only for a second, but it was enough to send a chill down the servant's spine. The uncle's bravado was slipping. He had begun to unravel. "I didn't do it alone," the uncle muttered, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "But you're too late to stop it now." The servant's pulse quickened. There it was. The admission that the uncle was not the mastermind, that there were others involved. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. "Who else?" the servant demanded, his voice hardening. "Who else was part of this?" The uncle's lips tightened into a thin line, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned away from them, staring out the window, his back to the two men. It was clear he was trying to compose himself, but the tension was too great. The servant could see the man's entire body stiffen with the weight of his own guilt. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the uncle spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah wasn't just being blackmailed," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "She was involved in something far worse. A deal she made with someone even more dangerous than I ever was." The man and the servant exchanged a glance. The truth was slipping further from their grasp. Yet something told them they were only a step away from the final revelation. "She was going to expose a ring of criminals," the uncle continued, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and remorse. "They were involved in smuggling, in stolen goods, in money laundering. She knew too much, and I couldn't let her ruin everything." The servant's mind reeled. Smuggling? Money laundering? This was not the innocent woman the man had known. But still, it didn't sit right. It didn't explain everything. There had to be more. "You're saying she was part of a criminal group?" the servant asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "She was working with these people?" The uncle nodded slowly, his eyes not meeting theirs. "Yes, she was part of it, but only for a short time. She tried to get out, tried to warn me about what was going to happen. But by then, it was too late. I couldn't let her ruin everything." The servant felt a sharp pang of confusion. It wasn't adding up. If Sarah was really trying to escape this dangerous world, why was she so alone? Why hadn't she reached out to anyone for help? And more importantly, why had the uncle been so determined to bury her? "What happened to the criminals?" the man asked, his voice raw with emotion. "What happened to the people she was trying to escape?" The uncle's gaze flickered momentarily to the man, then quickly shifted away. "They were dealt with," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I made sure of that." The servant's eyes widened. "You killed them?" he demanded. "You murdered them to protect your own interests?" The uncle's face twisted into an expression of something close to disgust. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice cold. "It wasn't just about saving myself. It was about saving our family. You have no idea what I was protecting you from." The man staggered back, his mind swirling with the weight of his uncle's words. The truth, as he had known it, was now completely shattered. Sarah, the woman he had always thought of as the innocent victim, had been caught up in something far darker than he could ever have imagined, and the man who stood before them, his own blood, had been the one to make sure that the truth would never see the light of day. But there was still something missing, still a piece of the puzzle that hadn't clicked into place. The servant could feel it, a nagging doubt that lingered in the back of his mind. What had really happened to Sarah? What had truly driven her into the arms of the criminals she had tried to escape? The answers were within reach, and the servant, though still filled with uncertainty, knew that he couldn't leave without finding them. They were on the edge of something much darker, something that had been buried for far too long. And just as the man opened his mouth to demand more answers, a sharp noise came from the other room, a sound that would change everything. The sharp sound echoed through the quiet house, cutting through the tension like a knife. It was a crash, a noise that seemed to vibrate through the walls, unsettling and unexpected. The man and the servant turned in unison, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. For a moment neither of them moved. The uncle, too, was still, his face drained of color, as though he had just realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. The silence that followed felt suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The crash had come from the back room, a narrow hallway that led to a locked door, one the uncle had carefully avoided since their arrival. The man stepped forward, his body tense, his every instinct telling him to find out what had caused the noise. His mind was still reeling from the shocking truths his uncle had revealed. But now there was something else, something urgent that demanded his attention. "What was that?" the man asked, his voice low but filled with an unmistakable sense of dread. The uncle hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously toward the back room. The servant could see the fear in his gaze, fear that was real, raw, and undeniable. This was no longer just a confrontation over family secrets. Something was wrong. Something was happening that neither of them could fully comprehend. Before anyone could respond, the sound came again. A louder crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of movement. Someone, or something, was in the room. The servant's heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively reached for the man's arm, pulling him back. "Stay here," the servant whispered urgently. "We need to be careful. This doesn't feel right." The man nodded, his face pale and tense. "But what about—" "I'll go," the servant interrupted. "Stay behind me." With that, the servant moved toward the hallway, his steps cautious but deliberate. The uncle, standing near the door, made no move to stop him. In fact, he seemed almost frozen in place, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the locked door at the end of the hall. It was clear now. He was afraid, and that fear spoke volumes. The servant reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He glanced back once more, but the man had not moved. The uncle, however, was visibly shaking, as if he knew something the others did not. Something was hidden behind that door, and whatever it was no longer willing to stay buried. With a swift motion, the servant turned the handle and pushed the door open. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a small window that was covered by heavy curtains. The air inside felt thick, oppressive, and in the center of the room, sprawled on the floor, was a body. The servant's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. It wasn't Sarah, but the man lying there was far too familiar. The body was that of the man's uncle's former associate, the one who had supposedly been dealt with all those years ago. His face was contorted in an expression of agony, his body twisted unnaturally on the floor as if he had been moved in a hurry. His clothes were torn and blood stained the once white shirt. The servant felt a rush of disbelief, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. He turned back toward the uncle, his voice trembling with disbelief. "What is this? Who is this?" The uncle's face twisted with guilt and fear, but there was no hiding the truth anymore. I thought it was over," he whispered. But it never ended. They came back. They They never left. The man stepped into the room, his eyes wide with shock. Who came back? What do you mean? The uncle's lips quivered as he spoke. The people Sarah was involved with, they weren't just criminals, they were a network. And they wanted her to be a part of something much bigger. I thought I had killed them all. But I was wrong. They found me. The servant's stomach churned. What do you mean they found you? Who are these people? They're not just criminals, the uncle continued, his voice shaking now with terror. They're something worse. A syndicate. An underground network of people who do things that can't be described. Sarah was supposed to be part of it. But when she tried to back out, they didn't let her, and I couldn't let her expose them. The man's face was a mixture of shock and confusion. But why? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you stop this? The uncle dropped his head, unable to meet their gaze. Because I was afraid. They made sure Sarah didn't live to tell anyone. And now, they've come for me. They've come for all of us. The servant's mind raced as the pieces started to fall into place. Sarah had not just been involved in some petty crime. She had been caught up in a network of dangerous people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And the uncle, driven by his own fear and guilt, had been part of it all, either by choice or out of necessity. But now, the truth was out, and it was clear that the man and the servant were not the only ones searching for answers. The body on the floor was a warning. And they were no longer just fighting for Sarah's memory. They were fighting for their own lives. As the man stepped forward, his voice shaky but determined, he spoke the words that had been building in his heart all along. I won't let this end like it did for her. We'll stop them no matter what it takes. The servant nodded, his resolve strengthening. We'll find the truth. We have to. But deep down, both of them knew the stakes had just escalated. They weren't just uncovering a family secret anymore. They were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous, something that could consume them both. The room seemed to close in around them as the weight of the revelation settled over the group. The body on the floor, twisted and bloodied, was not just a victim. It was a symbol of everything they had been too blind to see, too unwilling to confront. The man and the servant stood in stunned silence, processing the horror that had just been unveiled. The pieces of the story, once scattered and disjointed, were beginning to fit together in a horrifyingly clear picture. The uncle's words rang in the air. They've come for me. They've come for all of us. And now, it wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about survival. The servant looked at the man beside him, his face pale and drawn, but with a steely resolve. We have to act, the servant said, his voice low and tense. If these people really are a network, we can't waste time. We need to expose them, or we'll be next. The man nodded slowly, his mind still spinning. He had come here hoping for answers. Answers about his sister, about the lies, about the past that had been haunting him. But what he had uncovered was far beyond what he had ever expected. Sarah's life had been entwined with something far darker than he could have imagined. The uncle had hidden the truth for years, and now the truth had come crashing down, bringing with it not just guilt and shame, but an undeniable danger. The uncle, now shaking uncontrollably, stepped back toward the corner of the room. I never wanted you involved in this, he said, his voice ragged. I thought I could protect you, both of you. But now they know. They know what we've uncovered, and they won't stop until they silence all of us. Who are they? The man demanded, his voice growing more urgent. Who are these people? And why did they target Sarah? What did she know? The uncle hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as though the walls themselves might collapse if he spoke too freely. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. They're not just criminals, he said, his voice strained. They're part of a much larger operation, an underground network involved in smuggling, illegal trafficking, and... He paused, his voice breaking. And worse. Sarah was supposed to be a part of it, but she backed out. She wanted to leave, but once you're in, you can't get out. She was trying to warn me. She had a letter, a recording, proof of everything they were doing. The servant's heart skipped a beat. A letter? A recording? Where are they? The uncle's face fell, his body slumping with defeat. They were in her belongings. he said softly. "But when she died, I made sure no one found them. I destroyed everything." The servant clenched his fists. "You destroyed evidence? You destroyed the one thing that could have stopped this?" "I was trying to protect you both," the uncle cried, his voice rising in panic. "I thought if I erased everything, if I kept it all hidden, we could move on, leave it behind. But now it's too late. They've come for me and they'll come for you too." The man took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had come so far, had uncovered so much, but now he was faced with a new, more pressing reality. If Sarah had left proof of the network and if it had been destroyed, then there was no telling what would happen next. But one thing was clear. They couldn't let this go. They couldn't let Sarah's death or the terror she had been trying to escape go unanswered. "We need to find that proof," the man said firmly. "We need to track down whatever Sarah left behind. It's the only way to bring them down." The uncle shook his head, his face contorted in guilt. "It's gone, it's all gone. They took it from her when she tried to back out. And if they find out that you're looking for it—" The man took a step forward, his jaw clenched with determination. "They won't find out. Not if we move quickly. We'll find a way, we'll expose them, we'll bring justice to Sarah." The servant nodded in agreement, his mind already working through the possibilities. They didn't have much time. The network the uncle had described was vast, and the people involved were powerful, far too powerful for them to go after blindly. But they had no choice. They couldn't let the truth remain buried any longer. The uncle, clearly defeated, looked at the two of them with a mixture of fear and regret. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to drag you into this. But now it's too late. If you want to get out, now is the time. Once you go down this path, there's no turning back." "We're not turning back," the man said firmly. "This is about Sarah. It's about the truth. And we're going to finish this no matter what." As the man spoke, something shifted in the uncle's eyes, something like resignation, but also a flicker of hope, as though he too realized that they couldn't run from this any longer. The game had changed, and there was no way out except to confront it head on. With the last of his strength, the uncle stood up straighter, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't help you anymore. But you need to be careful. You need to trust no one. They're watching. And they know more than you think." The room fell silent again, the weight of his warning settling in their hearts. The man and the servant exchanged a glance, their resolve hardening. They had no choice but to face this head on. Sarah's death had set this in motion, but it was their actions, their courage, that would determine how it ended. They had come here searching for answers, but what they had uncovered was far bigger than either of them had anticipated. It was no longer just about exposing the criminals who had taken Sarah's life. It was about bringing down a network that had existed in the shadows for far too long. And as the servant and the man prepared to leave the house, they knew that the battle had only just begun. They had no idea what dangers lay ahead, but one thing was certain: they would fight for the truth, for justice, and for the memory of the woman who had been silenced far too soon.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.